We said we'd return and think about the threefold externality that Jacques-Alain Millet foregrounds when he does this kind of borrowing of a quote from what Lacan has to say on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis. So this idea, of course, is a disturbance at the innermost juncture of the subject's sense of life. There's three dimensions where this externality, this disturbance that occurs at the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life might be most manifest. The first that Jacques-Alain Millet draws our attention to is the question of social externality. What does he mean by social externality? I'll give a brief quote, and then we'll look to Stijn Vanheule's really excellent commentary on ordinary psychosis, which in a way is an engagement, a direct engagement with Jacques-Alain Millet's text to try and flesh this out. So back to Jacques-Alain Millet. He says, I've tried to organize this disturbance in the sense of life in accordance with the threefold externality. A social externality, a bodily externality, and a subjective externality. So, concerning the relationship with social reality in ordinary psychosis, the question is, what is the subject's identification with a social function and a profession, with their place in the sun? So we could say that we're thinking here about the roles of identification, and not just any identification, but with the identification of a certain social function. The clearest clue that this is an issue, that there's something that's missing here, is when you have a negative relation of the subject to social identification, says Jacques-Alain Millet. When you have to admit that the subject is unable to find, as it were, their place in the sun, when they find and struggle to assume a social function. Struggle to assume a social function. That seems a significant way of thinking about this. When, returning to the text, you observe a mysterious helplessness, a powerlessness in relationship to this function. And immediately he makes a qualification. This inability to take on a social function is not the same as the rebellious stance of the hysteric, and it's not the same as the autonomous way of the obsessional. Rather, there's some kind of gap which mysteriously constitutes an invisible barrier. When you observe what I call here a disconnection of a profound sort, you sometimes see the subject going from social disconnection to social disconnection, disconnecting from the business world, disconnecting from the family. This idea of disconnection seems to be very important. Stijn Vanheule does a nice description of it, but just while we're on this page, I want to note that Jacques-Alain Millet introduces a qualification. And you could say, actually, a kind of critique of how the notion of ordinary psychosis might be utilized. He tells us about the disconnection upon disconnection upon disconnection of social functions, of social roles, and then he says, you sometimes see this in the domain of schizophrenia. I've said schizophrenia here, but the reality of the subject, which may appear as an ordinary psychosis because it's not self-evident, deserves some kind of qualification. You as the clinician might see that this is ordinary psychosis. Once you've said it's ordinary psychosis, here's the quote, try to classify it in a classical psychiatric way. You mustn't stop at saying that it's an ordinary psychosis. You must go further than that and look for what it is in the classical psychoanalytic and psychiatric clinic. If you don't do that, and this is the danger of the concept of ordinary psychosis, it's what we call in French an assail de l'ignorance, sorry, can't pronounce it, a refuge for not knowing. If it's ordinary psychosis, what kind of psychosis is it? So I think this takes us a little bit back to the notion of ordinary psychosis as an epistemic category. It's not enough, as it were, to locate a subject and say ordinary psychosis. Ordinary psychosis will point to a series of phenomena, but it'll also mean more exploration is needed. And it will also indeed mean that you may need to find, or you should, for Jacques-Alain Millet, a much more detailed mode of description. He gives a description, an example of a colleague who does a case presentation. One of the people there says, this sounds to me that it's a sensitive paranoia in the sense of Kretschmer. Jacques-Alain Millet's comment, it wasn't ordinary psychosis because it was not self-evident, but once you've said that it's ordinary psychosis, it means it's a psychosis. And if it's a psychosis, it may be subject to classical organizational concepts. And I felt that this colleague was right. In this case, it was a sensitive paranoia. Ordinary psychosis must not be a permission to ignore the clinic. It's an invitation to go further than this term. So just to state that, I think this is really important. Back, though, to negative social identification. Negative social identification is something to be aware of, but it's not the only area where we see a disturbance in the ability to take on a social function, a symbolic role. He goes on to say, you also have to be alert to positive social identification in the ordinary psychotic domain. I mean, when the subject invests too much in their job, in their social position, when they have an over-intense identification with it. We can see that, in fact, being part of an organization, a club, may be the only principle of the world of an ordinary psychotic. Now, he does state this in a kind of more measured way, because you could say today, depending on where you live, what culture you exist in, what social situation, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that in my experience within American culture, having this job, having this social function, being in a way pretty fully identified with it, is kind of normative in this day and age. So he's aware of that, I think, but what we would be aware of, in other words, is what would be the limitations of, as it were, too total identification with a given social function. So not only is the negative evidence of apparent inability to be identified in that way, to assume a social role, a social function, we would also be aware of how sometimes that might seem, in some respects, too excessive. Now, I want to just utilize a couple of terms that Stijn Vanheule introduces when talking about these ideas. And he particularly emphasizes the idea of externality or disconnection. We've heard Jacques-Alain Miller say disconnection, but there's something interesting about how Stijn Vanheule mentions it. He says, a deep sentiment of not belonging and strangeness marks the self-experience as well as the experience of others. By taking on this focus on the feeling of externality or disconnection, the Lacanian approach actually strongly connects with contemporary phenomenological studies of psychosis, which stress that disturbed ipseity or anomalous self-experiences make up a central phenotype of schizophrenic spectrum disorders. So I just wanted to note that, sometimes there's a sense that these are two opposed traditions or they're going in very different directions, and that may well be the case. But here, in this prioritizations of feelings of externality and disconnection, we see something of an overlap, one which is hopefully instructive. Vanheule continues speaking about how we might be aware of something that occurs within the domain of the self-other experience. And again, he's trying to talk about what occurs here, which is deeply marked by not belonging, a sense of strangeness. And he speaks about a case study by a colleague called Castanet. Castanet's analysand is someone who suffers from a fundamental aloofness in relationship to his own ideas and in his own life, which is expressed in the idea that he lives his life in the mist. So we have here again separation both from a sense of one's own ideas and one's own life. And he goes on to offer a few other interesting notions. He says that what this case of Castanet exemplifies is a remarkable asubjective attitude in those domains of life, memories, life events, and sexuality, where one would expect that a person is touched by what comes to mind. The same asubjective attitude, which is thought to be typical of ordinary psychosis, also manifests itself in relationship to others, daily life, and transference, where no close connection seems to be made. So he also says, actually, and here Vanheule cites Castanet, memories accumulate but never make up a series and never provoke subjective movement. So just to highlight that point, something about, to make a quote here, remarkably asubjective attitude. Vanheule goes on to note, in line with the idea that psychosis as structure is marked by an inability to articulate what one as a subject desires in relationship to questions relating to subjectivity. Who am I? What do you want from me? Ordinary psychotic functioning is marked by a very low level of subjectivation. Characteristically, confrontations with these questions create the aforementioned experiences of subjective blackout or vagueness in ordinary psychosis. So just to highlight again, once again, that notion of the asubjective. Okay, let us turn back to what Miller is going to say. So we've spoken a little bit about negative social identification and what we could call a kind of excessive investment in those type of identities. But of his threefold externality, let us now turn a little bit to the notion of bodily externality. Again, Millet's description is helpful. He says the second clue, the second mode, you could say, of externality concerns the bodily other, the body as other for the subject, starting with the principle, you are not a body, you have a body. In hysteria, you have the experience of the strangeness of the body that has its own ways, but this is not quite the same thing. The innermost disturbance that he is speaking about here, as indicative of ordinary psychosis, is a gap where the body is unwedged, where the subject needs some tricks to reappropriate their own body, where the subject is led to invent some artificial bond to reappropriate their body, to tie their body to itself. To cast it in mechanical terminology, he needs a joint brace to connect with the body. Now again, we should distinguish between what might just be a kind of neurotic dissatisfaction with one's mirror image, which presumably we all have at some level, to this more marked disturbance at the innermost juncture of one's relationship to one's body. Millet goes on to talk about how we might find certain elements, certain devices that enable a kind of bonding with the body. And he talks about the use of tattoos. He says tattoos is one way of bonding oneself with one's body. Initially when I read that, I was like, well, maybe, you just don't realize how popular tattoos are at the moment. But again, I think he probably does. But the idea, I think, would be to see what is the supplementary element that enables one to assume a body. And again, I presume we all have that in slightly different ways. Fundamentally, you could say that's what the mirror stage is about, is how to assume and organize and have a consistent sense of one's own bodily experience as one's own. But again, that's not necessarily the case for everyone. In spite of the rebellion and disarray that we would see in hysteria, he says, is always somehow constrained. So he makes an interesting point here. How does this, as it were, gap, this inability to experience one's bodily sensibilities, one's own body in a kind of intimate, immediate, and obvious sense of possessed, this is me body, how do we differentiate bodily disturbances in hysteria from what he's talking about in ordinary psychosis? Well, you can't talk about it in terms other than those of tonality, a quote. It doesn't have the same tone, and in terms of excess, it exceeds the possibilities of hysteria. Hysteria is constrained by the limits of neurosis. There's always some question of castration at play. And that's the quote I just read. In spite of the rebellion and disarray, hysteria is always constrained, whereas you feel the infinite in the gap present in the relation of the ordinary psychotic to their body. Again, a lot more we could say about that. Interesting that he uses this reference to tonality there, but I like that emphasis, whereas you feel the infinite in the gap present in the relation of the ordinary psychotic subject to their body. Again, Vanheule can help us with this. He makes a reference to mirror stage phenomena. Let's see if I can just give you that very briefly. This is on page 86 of his chapter in this book. He says, the infant's, back to mirror stage, the infant's non-integrated experience of the body in combination with the thrust of the libidinal drives produced a generalized state of malaise. This generalized state of malaise is countered by the mirror image. Indeed, the mirror image, which also makes up the basis of the ego, comes into being as a defense against this troubling state in which a coherent imaginary body schema is not yet acquired. This process is never complete, but it can be observed in experiences of bodily fragmentation. In psychosis, by contrast, it's not that we have, as it were, a kind of semi-successful resolution, and it's never a full resolution, of how one takes on a body via the image, the mirror image. In psychosis, by contrast, bodily fragmentation is a plain reality. Particular corporeal experiences cannot be framed in terms of the body schema, and thus attract attention as eccentric manifestations which no sense can be made of. Ordinary psychosis is characterized by discrete experiences of such strange corporeal phenomena that might be interpreted almost as paranormal experiences. Millet refers to such experiences with the term body event, which stresses that the body functions as a mere scene on which corporal signs manifest. Okay, so once again, I think we have a sense here of how this is at a different level of bodily externality. Vanheule goes on to give the oft-cited example from James Joyce's A Portrait of an Artist of a Young Man, in which Joyce states that when Stephen was beaten, character in the book obviously, that when Stephen is beaten by a group of friends or by a prefect at school, he was not actually distressed. It's almost as if he kind of has a sensation of slipping out of his body. Okay, so we've dealt a little bit with questions of social externality. We've dealt a little bit with questions of bodily externality. Let's say just a little bit about subjective externality, and then we will draw to a close. Back to Millet, he says, after social reality, or the social other, and the bodily other, I will speak of the subjective other. Okay, of course, he's trying to differentiate these modes of externality. Frequently, it's an experience in the ordinary psychotic domain of the void, of emptiness and vagueness. This you may encounter in various cases of neurosis, but in ordinary psychosis, you look for a clue of a non-dialectisible quality. Remember the non-dialectical movement we mentioned before? You will look for a clue of a non-dialectisible quality of the void or vagueness. There's a special fixity to this element. He stresses that. We can again highlight a couple of moments in Vanheule, and he says, referring to the third domain, according to Miller, externality comes to the fore is at the level of subjective feeling, where a sentiment of oblivion prevails. Okay, a new term. Phenomenologically, such subjective externality is expressed in the experience of the void of emptiness and vagueness, and in experiences of incoherent identity. This incoherence indicates that identity is made up of identifications that are constructed with bits and pieces. And in the original lecture, the bits and pieces, Millet delights actually in the translation of flotsam and jetsam. So there's identification more with fragments than with something that is resolved, coherent, consistent. Back to Stijn Vanheule, at the basis of this experience of subjective externality, a fundamental inability to identify where the signifier can be situated, which contrasts markedly with neurotic identification. In neurosis, identification builds on the incorporation of a signifier. The result is that the subject is designated in relationship to an idea that defines who he is. It is a signifier that positively marks out who one is. A master signifier here functions as a subjective anchor that gives rise to further mental elaboration and to the development of a relatively coherent identity. And of course, this is the question, and this is the function that seems not to be working here. I will, I think, end with a quote from the Stijn Vanheule chapter that we've been looking at. And I'll do that, but just to say that in this series of lectures, we've tried to think a little bit about, just a way of wrapping things up to draw to a conclusion, we've tried to think about what is the notion of ordinary psychosis. We've emphasized that for Jacques-Alain Millet and others who comment on it, that it's an epistemic category, that we shouldn't think about it as a standalone diagnostic category of sorts. We could think about it as potentially an expansion of how we think about psychosis. We've highlighted the importance of thinking about mild psychosis. We've highlighted some of the critical thoughts aimed at the notion of borderline personality disorder. And we've also tried to highlight how, and of course this would be more a case that we would continue by looking at actual case studies, how their clinical work would take its focus at looking at exploring both the onset of a psychosis, the potential triggering, what might trigger the psychosis, and what might enable some kind of stabilization. And in this last of our lectures, we've tried to look at the threefold externality of bodily externality, social externality, and subjective externality. So just to wrap all of that up, I'm going to give a quote from towards the end of Stijn Vanheule's chapter, which does a little bit of a differentiation between neurosis and ordinary psychosis, which will draw this all to a conclusion. So it's on page 88 of his book chapter. He says this: schematically in neurosis, identification follows a path from a chaotic experience of drive-related arousal and jouissance to the initial naming of who one is via a crucial signifier, and to a further use of signifiers that articulate who one is. So we've got a kind of basic starting position of a kind of fragmentation, drives, jouissance, anxiety. But what gives this some kind of coherence is that there's a naming of who one is by the use of certain words, which can then link to the utilization of other signifiers as well. The result of this naming, and of course this is a reference to the naming that comes from the name of the Father, the result of this naming is that self-experience is not primarily linked to the chaotic experiences of drives of bodily arousal. This I is identified by speech and thus is above all a signified entity. I am an I which has some significance, which has an anchored subjectivity and sense of meaning. A crucial function of the name of the Father is that next to providing a lawful framework, it offers the individual a name that designates their unique singularity. This is so crucial, I think. It designates one's unique singularity so that one has a viable and substantial sense of selfness, of me-ness. In ordinary psychosis, the situation is different in that the initial naming via a signifier, a master signifier, fails to take place. The naming doesn't occur or doesn't hold, doesn't work. No master signifier anchors jouissance to other words, to other signifiers, to other signifying elements, and as a result, self-experience is above all marked by an ineffable experience of chaos, by an emptiness at the level of signified representation. Last sentence, given this lack of a primordial anchor in the signifier, all further use of signifiers to define an I tend to result in the flotsam, jetsam identifications. Flotsam, jetsam in bits and pieces, essentially, or in rigid as-if identifications that also bear witness to subjective emptiness. So in that comparison, once again, we see the question of subjective emptiness, and we also are directed a little bit, we didn't speak about it much here, but it's also an important topic in this broader theme of ordinary psychosis, to as-if identifications. As-if identifications, as discussed by Helene Deutsch, as itself a form of, you could say, psychotic level identification. But just to conclude, we could say that this is yet another example of the subjective emptiness that seems so indicative of ordinary psychosis.